Welcome back, everybody. Today we're going deep on someone you all know, Sir Isaac Newton.
Oh, yeah.
Laws of motion, the apple. You get the idea.
Right.
But who was this guy, really?
That's what's really interesting about Newton. He wasn't just this unfeeling brainiac just watching the world spin.
Right.
He was a real person with all the messiness and contradictions that brings.
Right.
And you see that reflected in his scientific work too.
Absolutely. And we have a ton of material to dive into today.
Yeah.
His writings, letters, historical accounts, the whole works.
It's a lot.
It really is. And the thing that gets me is how secretive he was. He waited years to publish his work on calculus and then all this stuff about alchemy and theology in private. Like, how does that fit with this image of a purely logical scientist?
Well, that's the exciting part. We get to explore not just the genius, but also the man behind it, right?
Right.
A guy who, even with all his success, was still battling with inner demons and some pretty out there beliefs.
Right.
It's gonna be good.
So let's go back to the beginning. Newton's childhood wasn't exactly a walk in the park.
Yeah.
Born premature Christmas Day, 1642. A tiny little guy coming into a world that had already seen some loss.
Definitely his father. A farmer died just 3 months before Newton was born, so his mom she was in a tough spot.
Yeah.
And then when he was just 3 years old, she remarried and decided to leave Newton with his grandparents.
Wow.
Tough situation all around.
You have to think that had a huge impact on him. There are stories about Newton's anger as a kid, even threats toward his mother and stepfather. It's hard to imagine what that must have been like emotionally.
Oh, absolutely. The sense of abandonment early on probably shaped a lot of his relationships later in life. He was famous for being a loner, burying himself in his work, super protective of his discoveries. It's like he was always trying to control things after having a childhood that felt so chaotic and uncertain.
But even with all that, his brilliance was obvious, even as a kid. 9 years old, he carved a sundial. This kid struggling with all this emotional stuff, and he's already fascinated by time and the universe.
That's wild.
Isn't it?
Yeah, and that fascination led him to King's School. His signature is actually still there, carved into a windowsill.
No way.
It's a real, tangible link to those early years when his curiosity really started blossoming.
But his path wasn't exactly straight.
Yeah.
His mom was widowed again and tried to pull him out of school to come back and work on the family farm. Can you imagine Newton as a farmer?
I mean, it's hard to picture.
It really is.
But thankfully, his schoolmaster saw how bright he was and convinced his mother to let him stay in school. That decision really paved the way for Newton to get to Trinity College, Cambridge in 1661.
Oh,
and
my.
that changed everything.
And even at Cambridge, you see that drive he had. To pay for his education, he worked as a valet, serving others, while his mind was already light years ahead.
It's incredible.
It is. And it's important to remember that Cambridge back then was all about the ancient Greeks.
Yeah.
But Newton wasn't satisfied with just taking their word for it.
No.
He questioned everything, tested everything, looking for truth through experiments and observations.
The foundation of the scientific method.
Exactly. He was already setting the stage for a revolution in science. And it wouldn't be long before those methods led to some major breakthroughs. But first, one of the most important periods of his life was just around the corner, the plague years.
Oh,
Yeah.
Here we go.
Things are about to get interesting.
Yeah, Newton's genius is about to be unleashed.
Exactly.
This is where things really take off.
The plague years, 1665 to 1667, England is being ravaged by the bubonic plague. Cambridge shuts down, and Newton heads back to Woolsthorpe Manor. It's almost like history gave him this time to just think and discover.
Yeah, it's crazy, right? The world's falling apart outside, and Newton's diving deep into math, physics, optics, setting the stage for a whole new era of science.
You mentioned his work with light during this time, like that famous prism experiment where he splits white light into all the colors of the rainbow.
Oh, yeah, that was huge. He took sunlight, shone it through a prism, and boom, a rainbow right there on the wall. He proved that white light is actually a mix of different colors, each one bending a little differently.
Which went against what everyone thought back then, right? Didn't Aristotle think color was like a property of the object itself, not something to do with light?
Yeah, Aristotle's theory was the go-to for centuries, but Newton's experiment turned that on its head. He showed that color is in the light itself. Objects just look colored because they reflect or absorb certain wavelengths. It was a game changer for how we understand light and color, like the foundation of modern optics.
And that led him to invent the reflecting telescope, right?
Exactly. Those old telescopes with lenses, they had this problem called chromatic aberration. Things looked blurry with like weird colors around the edges. So Newton thought, hey, why not use mirrors instead? And that's how the reflecting telescope was born. Way clearer, way more accurate observations. It shows how brilliant he was. He saw a problem and used his knowledge of optics to fix it.
It's mind-blowing that all this, the prism, the telescope, even the early ideas for calculus, it all happened during those plague years.
Hmm.
It's like being isolated supercharged his creativity.
Yeah, being able to focus without distractions can do that. But let's not forget about the apple, the story that supposedly sparked it all.
Ah, yes, the apple. I mean, it probably didn't actually hit him on the head, but
Right, probably not.
but he did see it fall and started thinking about what made it fall to the earth.
And then he thought, I wonder if that same force reaches beyond Earth. Like, what if it's holding the moon in orbit, too?
Exactly. His genius wasn't just in observing things, but in seeing the connections between them. He didn't just see an apple falling, he saw a universal principle, something that might govern the motion of everything on Earth and in space.
Mhm.
And that idea of describing this universal force mathematically, that's what led him to develop calculus.
Yeah, around 1666, completely separate from Leibniz-Newton, came up with this revolutionary math. Calculus gave him the tools to describe motion and change with crazy precision, which is key for his theory of gravity.
But he didn't publish his work on calculus right away, did he?
Nope.
And that's where things get messy. He ends up in one of the biggest scientific feuds ever with Leibniz over who invented calculus first.
Oh, yeah, the calculus controversy. It's a wild story, full of rivalry, ambition, and all the complications of scientific discovery. Leibniz published his version of calculus first in 1684, but Newton had been working on his for years, just keeping it to himself. He accused Leibniz of stealing his ideas.
It doesn't seem fair, though, to accuse someone of stealing something they couldn't have known about, especially since Newton was so secretive and didn't like sharing his work.
True, but Newton was super protective of his ideas and saw Leibniz's publication as a threat. He used his power as president of the Royal Society to try to destroy Leibniz's reputation, even writing an anonymous report that made him look better.
This whole dispute, while bad for both of them, does show how important it is to be open and share ideas in the scientific world.
Oh, absolutely. Open communication is key for progress. But anyway, back to Newton. So the plague ends, he goes back to Cambridge, becomes a fellow of Trinity College, and then at just 26 gets appointed as the Lucasian Professor of Mathematics. A huge honor. A position held by some big names before him.
So here he is, this young guy at the top of his field, already made groundbreaking discoveries in math, optics, physics. It's amazing. But even with all that, he was still known for being a bit of a loner, even a little paranoid, right?
Yeah, he was super dedicated to his work sometimes to the point of being antisocial. His lectures were often empty. Some stories even say he'd be talking to an empty room lost in his own thoughts. He was laser-focused on understanding the universe.
And that focus led to his masterpiece, Philosophiae Naturalis Principia Mathematica, better known as Principia, published in 1687. This is where he lays out his laws of motion and universal gravitation. It changed everything.
Principia was a turning point for science. It gave us a way to understand the motion of everything, from an apple falling from a tree to planets orbiting the sun. It solidified Newton's place in history as a true revolutionary.
But even with all his success in science, there was another side to him, these other interests that don't seem to fit with the image of a purely rational scientist.
That's right. We're talking about alchemy and theology, the secret world of Newton's obsessions.
This is where things get really interesting. The man who figured out the laws of the universe was also fascinated by the mysteries of alchemy and ancient texts.
It's amazing how much time he spent on these things. We know him for physics, math, astronomy, but he actually dedicated more of his life to theology and alchemy.
Okay, so we've talked about Newton's scientific achievements, his rivalries, his tendency to be a bit of a loner. But now we're getting into something that might seem surprising for a man of science, his fascination with alchemy and theology. This side of Newton isn't talked about as much, but I think it's important if we want to understand him as a person.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how much time and energy he put into these things. We celebrate him for his contributions to physics and math and all that, but he actually spent way more time on theology and alchemy.
Alchemy. Isn't that like the stuff of myths and legends? Turning lead into gold, the elixir of life? It just seems so different from the scientific method, the kind of thinking Newton is known for.
I know, right? It seems contradictory. But for Newton, these worlds weren't separate. He saw alchemy as a way to investigate the hidden forces of nature, to probe the secrets of matter and transformation.
So how did he square these two seemingly opposite ways of thinking? Did his alchemy stuff influence his scientific work in any way?
That's something scholars are still debating. Some say his alchemy was just a product of the times. It was a popular idea back then. Others think alchemy gave him a framework for understanding the world, a way to connect his scientific observations with his religious beliefs.
Speaking of which, I know Newton was a devout Christian, but his beliefs were a little out there.
Oh, yeah, definitely. He didn't believe in the Trinity, which is a pretty core Christian belief. And he spent years poring over the Bible, convinced it held a secret code that could reveal the truth about the universe and its future.
He even predicted the world would end in 2060. It's kind of wild to see this apocalyptic thinking alongside his scientific work. Was he trying to find some kind of theory that explained everything, both the physical and the spiritual?
Maybe. It's like his mind was always searching for patterns and connections, trying to figure out the underlying principles of both the natural world and God's plan. His theological and alchemical pursuits weren't just hobbies. They were part of his quest for knowledge, his desire to crack the code of the cosmos.
But all that searching, especially his experiments with alchemy, might have come at a price. Some historians think his exposure to mercury and other alchemical substances could have contributed to his mental breakdown in 1693.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong theory. There's some evidence to back it up. They found high levels of mercury in his hair after he died, which means he was exposed to it for a long time. And during his breakdown, he had symptoms that could be from mercury poisoning, like insomnia, paranoia, erratic behavior. He even accused his friends of plotting against him.
That must have been a really tough time for him, especially after all the success he'd had. So how did he recover from this?
He did eventually get better, but he was never quite the same. It was like a turning point in his life. He left Cambridge in 1696 and took a job as warden of the Royal Mint in London.
That seems like a strange career move for a brilliant scientist. Why the change?
It might seem odd, but Newton brought that same intensity and intelligence to his new role. He went after counterfeiters, reformed the English money system, and basically saved the country from financial ruin. And for his work at the Mint Queen, Anne knighted him in 1705.
Sir Isaac Newton. It's a title that reflects his incredible contributions to science and to England. But even with all the praise and recognition, he was still a complicated and sometimes controversial figure. He was super defensive of his legacy, sometimes doing some shady things to discredit his rivals like Robert Hooke. He even tried to erase Hooke's contributions from history.
It just goes to show that even the greatest minds have their flaws. Newton's story is this mix of genius, obsession, rivalry, ambition. He was driven to understand the universe, but he was also a man of his time, shaped by the ideas and beliefs of the 17th century.
So what can we learn from this complex figure, this man of science and secrets? What does his life tell us that we can apply to our own lives today?
I think Newton's story reminds us that people are complicated. We can hold beliefs that seem contradictory. We can be both rational and spiritual. And while his actions weren't always right, his pursuit of knowledge, his willingness to challenge the status quo, that's something we can all be inspired by.
It's like a reminder that learning is a journey, not a destination. And sometimes the most exciting discoveries are made in the unexpected places where science and faith and the human spirit all come together. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the life of Sir Isaac Newton, a man who continues to fascinate and challenge us centuries later.